languages in general, and this is the first one.
Oh, the logical and mathematical one is being able to solve problems and recognize patterns.
Musical is skill in the performance, composition, and appreciation of musical pattern. And Gardner also links it, and the quote says, almost a structural parallel to linguistic. And we were talking about how, yes, it's interesting that, musical and linguistic are similar. We were also talking about the music-math connection, and that they're definitely all like linked.
The bodily kinesthetic, the use of the body to solve problems, ability to use mental to use the body to coordinate what's around you, I guess.
And then the spatial one, this one was interesting. I think that the body kinesthetic one is sort of using your body to do something, but then the spatial one is how that's interacting within the space that you're actually in. So those two seem to be linked as well. Oh yeah.
And with the personal intelligence is it's the ability to understand others and empathy.
Work effectively with the other. That was towards the bottom of the page.
So it's more or less about the skill of being able to relate to others, connected with social skills.
And the intrapersonal is the capacity to understand oneself. And we had an interesting little sub-conversation because the way he defines it was like basically sort of having having self-knowledge so that you can like cope in the world. And then we were like, oh, well, you can have a negative self-image of like, oh, I'm not good at anything, and yet carry yourself through the world. So that can be like helpful, can be unhealthy, but helpful in
intelligence
giving yourself a worldview of yourself.
It's the intelligence, I think, independent
of
whether you feel good or
value,
bad about the value.
Or someone who thinks they're totally great, who you might not say that they know themselves very well. And it was interesting. And the one that there were originally 7, and then some people say there's now 8. Right? That sort of depends where you read. Someone else want to read this one, or is it my handwriting too hard to understand? Naturalistic is recognizing and being aware of the environment, and I guess that also implies the value of the environment. We were talking about it's not just about like going to the park; it's also about like the environment, like where the context that one is in, the cultural environment. This
and there's a couple that are sort of debates, existential, spiritual, and moral, and they really talked about that mostly in terms of why the issues with them are, as opposed to why they may be, they may actually work. Like spiritual, the problem there is that you're trying to define an intelligence based on something that is not provably true. So you may believe in it, but how do you test that? And the moral one was, we didn't get that far. That was
knowing.
It's too individualistic, I think, to be able to say that there was a general.
A definitive.
Yeah.
Right.
Exhibit A, politics in
Right.
the U.S. right now.
Yeah.
That's pretty definitive. That was what we got.
Thank you. Any questions, additions, complications? Yes.
I just thought it was interesting you just reading. I've been aware of these theories for years and read some things about them, and I hadn't realized until we did the readings in here how much controversy there was.
Yeah.
Over these theories. That's really interesting.
Yeah, pay attention to those controversies because then it's important because first of all, it means people that are reading them critically. But second of all, it means people are actually considering what it says and not just taking it for face value. The problem with a lot of these theories is they can become buzzwords. And the power of the buzzword can take over what the actual content is. And I'll give you like the most perfect negative example I've ever experienced. I was on a panel, this was probably like 15 or 18 years ago, I was on a panel at a New York State sort of arts ed conference. And right before the panel was starting, I was meeting this guy who was an art educator from some university upstate. I was like, oh great, okay, we're both talking about multiple intelligences, so give me a quick overview of what you're talking about so we can make sure it doesn't totally overtake you. And he goes, I just throw out the buzzwords. I have no idea what it means, but it impresses everybody. And I just sort of looked at him and said, okay then, we're going to have a really interesting panel. And I just thought, oh, this is really bad. So I think of all the buzzwords that we've heard today, the multiple intelligences has been the worst. And that's why I bring it up here, you know. And so this was going, Howard Gardner wrote this book over 20 years ago, the original book from which the multiple intelligences were taken. And there have been many, many books since then. The sort of like popular, you know, this is the new thing, energy of it kind of took on a life of its own. And a lot of people said, you know, we're teaching the multiple intelligences. We're doing the multiple intelligences. We're, you know, fill in the blank, the multiple intelligences. But people didn't really put in the thought that it took to like, what does this theory mean? How do you apply it? What is it to teach the multiple intelligences? Does it really mean to do? What does that mean? And that's where I would like express, you know, take on any of these things with a little bit of caution. One thing that Howard Gardner never did was create an actual activity of multiple intelligences. All the people who took that on did it on their own. And a place that was really interesting is there, you know, really like in the late 80s and early 90s when everybody was sort of on this bandwagon, so to speak, there were places that called themselves multiple intelligences schools. He didn't go around the country and say, I want you to do this and do this. People sort of took this on their own. And I don't think there's anything left that actually does that. So it sort of did its little vogue popularity thing and then it kind of waned because also it was people's interpretation or misinterpretation of what that meant. So with all that in mind, it's not a negative thing to think about. I just want to give you all the cautions first. There is, however, a good deal of criticism about it. Though Howard Gardner is a really interesting and thoughtful and thought-provoking person. So when the group takes him on in more depth, that's a chance to really go into some of the readings and also into some of the criticisms and talk about what it is and what it is not and what its value for us. I think its primary value from my perspective is the conversation that it opened up to the point, and that's how Benny introduced it. We talked about, you know, he's smart, she's smart, on the basis of something called the IQ test. Does everybody remember the IQ test? Okay. What does the IQ test actually measure? Linguistic and logical. You know, so people were labeled. You know, you have fast learners, slow learners. You know, you have whole classes in school on the basis of just those things. What was not taken into account, at least with the original IQ test, was all the variations, you know. And he opened up the conversation of all the ways in which you're smart. And we see it all the time, you know. If you've ever worked with autistic kids, do you work with autism? Okay, they maybe cannot have a conversation with another person. So there's no intrapersonal intelligence that you can see. But God, they're just, this person is a whiz at X. You know, there are just so many different ways that people are smart. I actually once, bless you, taught a whole class where this guy sat the whole time. He was autistic. He sat with a parrot, did nothing. And when everybody else was done moving, it was in elementary school, he got up and did the most amazing dance. And all his classmates were just like, where did that come from? You know, there was so much going on inside him. And, you know, they just treated him like this dumb kid over at the side, you know, who they just ignored. but he just had a different manner of expressing his comprehension of this particular lesson and his own time frame and everything else. The point is, whether or not you believe in multiple intelligences as he has described them, we all have different strengths and weaknesses. And if you take it from that perspective, then it can start to become a very usable theory. Yes?
Where did the phrase of like different types of persons come from? It's very much like this, like a person lives.
Yes.
Does it branch off of here?
Yes.
Okay.
Because then we said, you know, for instance, there are visual learners, there are oral learners, there are people who like to talk a lot in class, there are people who are totally quiet in class, you know, all those things. That's sort of a branch out of this, and that's really a good piece also to make sure that everybody has their chance to shine or to be, you know, to express themselves. Yes?
I had a chance to work on a project where I had to come up with examples of how dance education applies, or we can work on targeting all those,
Yes.
each one of them particular, and the different exercises or activities that we can do that target the different intelligences. It was really interesting to see that we do that. It ties all together to whether we are working on scaffolding, or you know, everything that just we work as a dance educators, we definitely touch on these different parts of every kid's brain, like whichever is stronger, but we have an opportunity to work on that and engage the oral, the visual, the kinesthetic, the linguistic. Like there's always something that we can do. It was interesting to work on.
Yeah. The other place where it became really important is, you know, this was becoming a really popular theory at the time that elementary schools were getting really into having centers. Does everybody know all about centers? Okay, yes, Alicia's shaking her head. Yes. Describe centers to us for those who don't know.
It's basically having different areas or different things for the kids to work on. It looks different in different grades. Like with my little 4-year-olds, we would have a lot of centers based on social development and like those foundation developments. We would have like a pretend and learn center. We would have a writing center. We would have an art center, and we would have a library with people who go get books and different. And as you go up, like you can have centers based just on writing, where you break the kids off and get them working.
So are those zones within the classroom or a different room that you go
They're
to?
in the same
It's in
classroom.
the
It
same
is,
class.
okay.
Yeah, and it's like a separate time from like the main instruction. It's
Right.
basically to build on the main instruction.
Yeah. So the way that centers could be used, now think back to this and think of the multiple intelligences. So let's say somebody who's a really strong, let's say, linguistic learner, but stays away from logical mathematical, not a strength. You've sort of diagnosed this kid according to Gardner's theory. And so every time your center time is open, this kid's always going to go to the library center and work on his strengths and make them even stronger. But you as the teacher or the, yes, will try to guide this child a little to the math or manipulative center because you recognize that that's not a strength of the child. And then the other positive of the center sort of arrangement is that the library center, this kid can work at a much different level than at the manipulatives or math center because, you know, we don't have, you know, the same level across. So even if you find ways to criticize this, you can see right away for kids, you know, if they're in the 4th grade, they're not doing the 4th grade exact level in every possible area. They may be really advanced in reading and analysis of reading and not so advanced in the mathematical, you know, things. And that's where Gardner's theories really make sense because you see that even within one child there's variations. So that theory helped teachers really think about